and welcome to my podcast on real relationships. My name is Sophie Poisson, and I am a relationship expert, international speaker, and best-selling author of a book, Your Other Half. I decided to start this podcast because, in my opinion, relationships are currently not being portrayed as what they really are. Whether you're watching the news, TV, social media, the perception given to people is wrong. And my aim is to talk about what happens in the real world, talk about real stories, and listen to what real people think, do, or go through, as opposed to creating expectations of something that doesn't actually exist. I may not agree with everything that is said by my guests, but it is their chance to express their opinions and their stories. And here today we have Cynthia Spillman, and we are going to talk about loss. Hi, Cynthia.
Hi. Thank you for asking me.
No worries at all. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself, please?
Yeah, so I was born and brought up in Glasgow. My mother was French. My father was of Russian Jewish parentage. And I lived in Scotland until I was 26. And my first language was French, and I'm still bilingual. Then when I was 26, I ended up going to Cambridge, and then after that, London. And now I'm in Herefordshire, and I split my time between Herefordshire and Nice.
Okay, so tell us about the story and what happened, because it's not just loss we're going to talk about, it's losing a child, which is something that no parents ever expect to have to go through.
No, I always say it's a club that nobody wants to become a member of.
Yeah.
Is losing a child. And there's no doubt that it is the worst thing possible. For me, what happened was I was living in Cambridge with my first husband. I got married very young, got married at 19 to somebody who was a lot older than me, and somebody I didn't particularly want to marry, but that's another story. A lot of parental pressure. And I had two kids by the time I was 23. And we bounced all over the country because my then husband was a compulsive spender. So we lost our homes, and we always had the bailiffs at the door. And anyway, so we ended up in Cambridge in 1985. And in 1987, I was driving my kids to school. It was the 20th of November, 1987. And I was stationary, and I was hit from behind by a lorry, and the petrol tank exploded. And it was all very, very quick. But I turned around and I saw my son, Anthony, who was 5, burned to death. He was just a ball of flames. And my daughter, Samantha, known as Sam, was severely disfigured facially and spent many, many years having major reconstructive plastic surgery.
So obviously, apart from the obvious of loss, it's traumatic.
Yeah,
it was the way traumatic. It happens. But yeah. I anticipate there's that motherly instinct that wants to take over but can't.
Yes, you feel so powerless. We were all trapped in the burning car, and a rescuer pulled me out and pulled Sam out, and I was dragged into a neighboring house, and she went off in a separate ambulance from me. But it was like a double loss, because she was so badly burned. She didn't look like the child I'd given birth to. Mm-hmm. So it was like having to learn to love another child, whilst containing all my enormous grief about the way my son had died, and having to freeze it. So it got very complicated. And in those days, there wasn't, it wasn't handled well. Right. Hospital. They didn't know what to say.
How long were you in the car for then?
It was one of these freak accidents. I never was in that car at that time, but that particular day I'd taken my then husband, to the station. And really, I was a quarter of a mile from home. Stationary, you don't expect that to happen.
No.
Quarter of a mile. And the lorry driver had driven up from Cardiff that morning. It was at 8:18 because, the tachometer recorded it on Friday, the 20th of November. And we never found out what happened, if he fell asleep or whatever. And so we weren't in the car for very long. And that was horrendous. And also, I was on fire too. I mean, I had my hair was on fire, my clothes were on fire, my eyebrows were on fire. I was very lucky not to have worse physical injuries.
Yeah,
I had
yeah.
a fractured scapula because the impact was so, severe, and superficial burns. But of course, later I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder.
But yeah, I was going to talk about that in a bit. So what happens next sort of thing? So daughter off to one side of the hospital, so to speak, you to the other, and then what were you feeling? What
Oh,
does
well, there
do
was
or...
a catalogue of, feelings. When it happened and I was dragged into the neighboring house, I thought they were both dead because, what I'd seen. I thought they were both dead. And eventually the flying doctor came in and said to me, well, your son is dead, and his body is by the roadside, and your daughter is severely burned, and we don't think she's going to make it. But there were several things that were terrible around that as well. The ambulance didn't come for nearly an hour because they thought it was a hoax.
Right.
I got carted off in one ambulance, and the lady and her husband who had taken me into the house, she came with me, but the ambulance driver was very rude, and it was like all these weird feelings. I remember sitting in their kitchen asking for a sweet cup of tea when I don't even like tea, and looking out the window and having this surreal feeling, noticing they had a swimming pool, and then thinking, well, both my kids are dead now. And so I didn't get hysterical. If anything, I didn't react enough. And I remember thinking, I've got to phone my parents and tell them. I've got to get hold of my husband. It was like I was practical. I became very practical. And it was a shock. I was in shock.
Yeah. And I think worst, it wasn't as bad as this, but when I found my dad dead, I remember that. But the first thing that kicked in, despite the fact it was very obvious he had been dead for quite a while, was to ring. I don't know. There's nothing they could do but ring. And they always used to like switch off the landline and stuff like that, and the Wi-Fi at the wall, and I could not work out how to put it back on. My brain wasn't computing. So I grabbed my mum's phone, it was hysterical, and I'm trying to get her to unlock it, which she managed to do. And then I'm like, I'm in France. It's not 999. And all I was like, what's the fucking number? And she's like, it can't be happening. It can't be happening. I'm like, what's the fucking number? And that's when I got a bit angry, but it was more of a practical side of it.
Yes.
I'll be like, right, I need to take charge of this. A, B, C, D needs to happen, sort of thing.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. You kind of go into operational mode. Because I remembered my parents' phone number. It's crazy at a time like that.
Yeah.
So it was really difficult. And then I went in, as I say, I was taken by separate ambulance. They wouldn't let me see my daughter, but I could hear her screaming. And when I got to the hospital, this was outside Cambridge, so it was Addenbrooke's Hospital. And I went in to A&E, and one of the staff said to me, it was the radiographer, because my shoulder was sore. And she said, oh, you silly girl, what have you done? So she obviously hadn't been briefed. And I just said, well, actually, my son's just burned to death and my daughter's probably going to die, and I thought it was awful. It was just awful. It was like insult added onto grief. And like the nurses were crying and I was trying to comfort them. It was like a pantomime.
Yeah. So obviously once all of this it has gone by, sort of thing, how were you feeling then with it? Because I think sometimes there's an element of guilt that you couldn't prevent, that you shouldn't have been there. What would have happened if? All of this.
Of course. I mean, I think as a mother, you always think it's your duty, to your obligation to keep your children safe.
Yeah.
And I had failed to keep my children safe. And at that point, I didn't quite know what had happened, because at first I thought there'd been an electrical fault with the car, and I didn't realize that I'd been hit. But so there was that. And then I remember I was taken into, admitted to the hospital and put in a room on the 6th floor. And I remember the lights were all off. And I remember my head was exploding. And I remember I felt like I was going to be sick all the time. And then people started arriving. And, you know, at first they said, the doctor said, well, she's not going to survive. And then they said, well, the next 24 hours are crucial, but they wouldn't let me see her. But I was just in shock because at that point, the shock had started to hit in and people started to arrive. You know, my parents arrived that night. And I remember just lying there in the bed, just like a zombie, refusing all medication, but just like trying to get control. And I stank of burning as well.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
So how, once all of this, you know, you were at the hospital and stuff, how did you cope with it?
Well, the first shock I got was the next day when I saw my daughter in intensive care, because nobody had warned me what
with severe burns.
Yeah, I didn't. I just thought, well, she'll look like herself, but with a few burns. And I remember going in to see, and she was on she was intubated and she was on a ventilator, and all I could see that was recognizable was her ponytail and some pink nail varnish on her toes. I mean, it was horrendous. And, you know, I could smell it from the corner. And I was so overwhelmed that I ran out and I nearly passed out. I've never passed out in my life, but I came close to it. And I went back to my room. And then in the middle of the night, I thought, no, I have to get a grip. This is my life now. I have to go back. And that was it. And I never abandoned her ever again. But we were in hospital at the beginning for nearly 3 months.
Right.
So very, very difficult because I was like in this cocoon of hospital.
Which is not, inverted brackets, real life.
Yeah, that's right. And you know, I could see all these people with their normal lives. And I would think, how can life carry on? You know, how can I still breathe? How can I still pee? How can I, you know, my body function when I've had this horrendous shock? And then when we went home after 3 months, that was really scary too, because, well, for one thing, she was in and out of hospital having surgery.
Yeah.
But, you know, I was then responsible. And my husband at the time was just useless. I mean, he was in the pub the whole time getting drunk. And I was responsible, you know, for caring for her, taking her to hospital to have these terrible, painful things done. And at that time, we'd lost our home again and we were renting a house, and it was just 2 minutes walk from where Anthony was buried. And that was terrible because I would lie in bed at night thinking, you know, is he cold? I mean, crazy things. And of course, I didn't go to his funeral. And a large part of that was because my mother was horrendous and I knew she was going to make it all about her. And also I stayed with Sam in the hospital. So there was a bit missing for me.
The closure bit.
Yeah, the closure bit, because I never saw him again. I saw him go up in flames and I never saw him. I didn't see a coffin. I didn't go, you know, I went to the grave after the funeral, but it's not the same.
It's a stone. It's not a person.
Yeah. So it was very, very difficult. And for months, I just kept going because my daughter needed me. And I had to freeze my own grief. And that made it very complicated. So what happened then was, about 6 months after the accident, I started to really feel my feelings. I started to develop all sorts of phobias, terrible panic attacks, agoraphobia, claustrophobia. It was a nightmare, a complete nightmare. And I
suppose you got nightmares as well.
I got some nightmares. Yeah, I got some nightmares and some flashbacks. But, you know, just getting through the day was terrible. And I couldn't let my daughter see me like that. So I almost had a sense of, you know, looking back on myself, looking back at it now, I've got compassion for myself, because the other thing I discovered, and I don't know if this has been your experience too, but 6 months after, like, oh, the drama is over. Everybody thinks you should be getting on with life.
Yeah.
And that's when you need people the most. And, you know, and my parents weren't helpful and said things like, well, you've still got one child. Well, yeah, but that child wasn't like the child I'd given birth to. And that child was a constant reminder of what had happened to the other one. And I decided that I wanted to have another baby, which was crazy because you know, I'd never been happy in the marriage. And I wanted out long before. Well, I never wanted to marry him, but then I wanted out and couldn't get out. So I got pregnant about 5 months later, And it was the classic, replacement
Yeah.
child, because I wanted a boy. I wanted it to be a boy. And when I was about 10 weeks pregnant, I started bleeding, and I went for a scan, and they said it was the baby was dead. So I had to go through the whole thing, in hospital and deal with that. But that was a turning point for me, because I decided that that was like a sign that I was to do something else with my life. I
Yeah.
knew I couldn't stay in that marriage.
Yeah.
So I decided, as I was living in Cambridge, and I had no option but to try and study in Cambridge because Sam was in and out of hospital there. I decided to try to get into Cambridge to do a law degree.
Mhm.
And so, despite having all these dreadful panic attacks and Sam being in and out of hospital, I started studying for two A levels part time,
Mhm.
less than a year after the accident. And I got a conditional place at Cambridge University to study law.
Yeah.
And but by the time that first year was over, um, and just before my A levels, I was in such a state that I had to go on Valium, something I'd always said
Mhm.
I would never do. I couldn't function anymore. I was so scared all the time. And so I sat my A levels at home. I was on Valium, which toned things down a bit. And I somehow I exceeded the grades I needed to get into Cambridge.
Yeah.
So, in 1989, I went to Cambridge and did a law degree.
And did that help you to cope with
Oh, enormously. I
yeah.
always say it was a life raft in a sea of misery
Yeah.
because it gave me a purpose. If I think if both of my kids had died, I think I would have jumped off a cliff,
Yeah.
but it gave me a purpose, it gave me an identity. I'd always wanted to study law, but my father, who was a judge, was very misogynistic, and he said women make bad lawyers. And I got into Cambridge in secret. I didn't tell my parents because I knew
Mhm.
they'd pour cold water over it. But the Cambridge thing was a brilliant idea. And it saved me. Those 3 years saved me. It's not to say I didn't have all the problems
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
other new problems developing, but it gave me a focus and an identity other than, the mother whose child had burned to death.
And how, because obviously at the beginning there was a, oh, I don't recognize my daughter, but did it change your relationship with your daughter?
Well, it did. I mean, I think that, she has turned out brilliantly. She
Mhm.
is a success in every way. And I joke to her, I say, well, you turned out brilliantly despite having me as your mother. But it was difficult because she was obviously angry. And
Yeah.
of course, I was the safe target.
Yeah.
And my mother was particularly nasty and, used to have a lot of fun pitting my daughter against me, which was unforgivable. But, we've got a really great relationship now.
Mm. And obviously you tried to hold the emotions back.
Yes.
What happened when they came flooding out?
Well, it was that whole thing about panic,
Yeah.
and I left my husband 5 weeks before my second year finals at Cambridge because
Well,
we were going to be homeless again. And I told him I was leaving. And he didn't want me to do my degree. He said, I want you to stay the same cute kid that I married. And if you do it, it's with Anthony's blood money. It was terrible. And I was angry. So I was fired up, fueled by anger,
to do it.
despite being a wreck, feeling I was a wreck. And somehow that anger was a positive force.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it motivated me because everything was shot in my life. My nerves were shot.
Yeah. And now, as you said earlier, you can see and give yourself compassion. But
Yeah,
at the time, I suppose you couldn't.
I couldn't. And I had very harsh parents saying, "Come on, snap out of it," and and no support really. So it was very, very difficult. And I went into therapy in 89, and I had a very good therapist for about 7 years. And he glued me together again
Mhm.
enough to function because he understood, and I mean, I went a bit crazy at university. I drank too much. I went with too many men. I mean,
it's a natter, isn't it?
Yeah, I took far too many Valium, too many sleeping pills, and of course I developed addictions.
Yeah.
But again, I don't give myself a hard time for that now, because where the hell was the script for what I was going through?
Yeah, quite. And it's when things like that happen, we sometimes want something or someone to blame. Do you think that?
Well, it's interesting you should say that, because, and this is very sad, but when I was pulled from the car, my first thought was, this has happened to me and my kids because I'm a bad person.
Right.
And that's my childhood. My childhood being brought up by narcissistic parents who made me a scapegoat, convent school education, being abused by nuns, was all of that. And yes, so I thought I'm being punished, which now I realize is complete nonsense. But yeah, and of course, there's another part to the story which I haven't mentioned, in that the lorry driver who caused the accident got off with a fine of £150.
Right.
In nearly 36 years, we never heard from him. He never apologized. When he went to the magistrate's court, my father went to the trial. I didn't go. And, he gave my father the V sign. His family jeered. It's disgusting. And to this day, I'd love to eyeball him to say, why did you not even apologize? I know he didn't do it deliberately, but I cannot understand how anybody can destroy lives like that and not even apologize or not even want to find out what happened.
Yeah, it put themselves first, really, isn't it? If you don't see it didn't happen. So with that, I suppose, there's no forgiveness that's going to happen anytime soon.
No, I mean, it's just, and most of the time it doesn't torture me, because I do have a brilliant life today, and I've recreated a life which is actually better than the life I ever had before. Of course, I want my son back and my daughter the perfect way she was. But occasionally I still get angry, like, Anthony would have been 40 last October. And I got really angry again with the lorry driver. And for many years, I knew exactly where he lived. Yeah. And in fact, he lives, we're near the Welsh border. He lives in Wales. My brothers wanted to take a contract out on him. I had his address and I did nothing with it. But it's occasionally I'll get this, why? Why after all these years?
But it's anniversaries, isn't it? It's often birthdays and Christmas and, anniversary of death and stuff like that.
Yeah, and I wonder every 20th of November, I wonder if he thinks about it or if he's conveniently, forgotten what he did.
Would you say that you've come to a place of acceptance?
Yes, I mean, I accepted it a long time ago, because otherwise I couldn't live with it.
Yeah.
And, I know enough because I've supported a lot of bereaved parents in my time, and I still do it intermittently. I know what happens to people who don't accept it. I have to accept. I don't like it. And, there are still lots of triggers, like you said, birthdays, anniversaries. I see Anthony's friends at 40, married with kids, and I think, what would he have looked like? But I have to accept it. But it still makes me sad, it makes me sad, because he only had 5 short years. He was robbed of his life. And for me, I have tried my best to live the life he should have had. But it's not easy. It's not easy. And I get upset when people, moan about what hard work it is looking after kids. And I just think, well, you should walk in my shoes and the shoes of other bereaved parents, or the shoes of people who can't have children. I mean, I had 3 miscarriages and all. So I've had a lot of loss.
Yeah.
But yeah, I get annoyed with people moaning about their kids. Well, nobody forces you to have them. They're a gift, and not everybody gets that gift.
Yeah. And what would be your advice to someone going through it?
So what I would say is, be very gentle on yourself. Reach out for help. For me personally, I found that finding a bereaved parents who had been through it and who had come out the other side and had some kind of life, a positive experience, helped me the most. So the professionals with the best will in the world, they haven't walked the same path.
Yeah.
And there was one woman who was a friend of a mutual friend of mine, and she had lost a daughter, a 5-year-old daughter, 3 years before my accident. And my friend said, would you like her to come to hospital? And I said, yes. And now that woman has been my shining beacon of hope for 35 years, and we're still very close friends. She really helped me. She said, it'll be okay. You'll come through it. It's absolutely normal to feel the way you're feeling. It's just a catastrophe, but there will be life, there will be hope, and there will be joy again. And she was right. There has been.
At that point, you can't see how that's ever possible.
No. And I always used to think, oh, bullshit. People who tell me that didn't obviously love their child as much as I loved mine. But it's been my experience.
Yeah.
But it's true.
And would you say that, to kind of finish it off, because I think that sometimes we can get into a bad space where we're negative and stuff.
Yeah.
And even more so with something like this. But do you now recognize the signs in advance, or?
Well, for me, I know when my mood is going down, and I believe that asking for help is a sign of strength and not weakness. So I have always availed myself of help. I've always been able to talk about it, which for me has saved me. I've always had a sense of humor, even in the darkest moments, because otherwise I might as well shoot myself. And what I'd also say is I think it's really important for people who have suffered losses to find some kind of purpose. Now, for me, that was helping other bereaved parents, which I still do, and also Cambridge. Cambridge was a wonderful, distraction, and a good distraction.
I think it's hard sometimes because it is good to have a distraction as long as you're still doing the kind of grieving and not just putting it on hold, isn't it?
Yeah, because you don't want to distort the grief, because my grief did get distorted and circumvented because I had no option but to do that to look after my daughter, but it came back and bit me in the bum. There's no doubt about it. And I would always say to people, don't try and avoid it, sit with it, go through it. The only way out is through it, and there will be a light at the end of the tunnel that isn't an oncoming train. And hang on to people who are positive. Don't hang on to people, because there are people I know who are pathological about it, about grief. And we are programmed as humans to survive. I'm not religious, but I know that within me, it was that Camus quote about the invincible summer. Within us, I believe that there is a power, don't know what it is, but we're programmed to survive.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. Well, if you just go back to the caveman, isn't it? Everything that they did was about survival.
Yeah, and if you look at people like Viktor Frankl, and the Holocaust, he survived that. His attitude. Yeah.
And watching, the people around you and the fear that you experience and all the rest of it. Yeah. Well, Cynthia, thank you so much for sharing your story with us. Anything else you would want to add?
No, people can always contact, if they want any help with grief.
Well, thank you so much. That's all we've got time for today. And for everybody else, if you enjoyed the show, then please subscribe, leave us a review, and come back for the next episode. Thank you.